My name is Naik, CEO of TransUnion Africa. Yesterday we had the chance to listen to the revised budget speech presented by our Finance Minister. Today I have a chance to sit with Ayesha Hatea, TransUnion South Africa's Head of Research and Consulting, to reflect on the key takeaways of the budget speech and what it means for everyday consumers. Welcome, Ayesha.
Thanks, Lee.
So Ayesha, one of the key things as my takeaway was there's been an increase in VAT of some 0.5%.
Yeah.
And as a consumer myself, I'm worried about the impact it has on me. But help us understand, in your reflection as Head of Research and Consulting, what should a consumer be aware of? What does this mean to us as consumers?
Yeah, so I think it does put further strain on household income. I know in our last CPS they were saying, 65% were saying that they are able to service their debt in full. And that came with relief from the interest rate cuts that we saw. Reality is this might counteract that and further strain the ability to actually repay those debts that they've committed to.
So that's interesting. Banks have reported that the average take-home salary actually increased in January when compared to the previous month, at the last month of 2024. So now people are quite buoyant. We've had 3 successive interest rate declines, so that's improved disposable income. But as TransUnion, we worry about disposable income.
Yeah.
Why do we worry about disposable income? And what should consumers worry about and what it means from next month?
Yeah, well, I mean, the disposable income is what they get to live with. So with the increase in VAT, also knowing that the tax brackets are staying the same. So those same people that got the increases may also be moved into higher tax bracket, and there was no sort of compensation for that in this budget speech. So they could have actually ending up paying more tax from a personal perspective, further decreasing their disposable income. So ultimately they have less money in their pocket, less money to service their debts. So we would need to keep an eye on that. Our lenders would need to keep an eye on that strategically. We might even find clients looking to extend additional debt to help them close some of the shortfalls or the gaps that they've seen with this initial adjustment in their household incomes.
There's a lot you've covered there, so let's break it up a little bit. Not everybody pays taxes in South Africa. In fact, we have a very, very small tax base.
Yeah.
One of the first takeaways for me was that for the people that don't pay tax, VAT affects all of us.
Yeah.
One of my takeaways was that the government has passed a 0 rate on many food items.
Yeah.
But the reality is that not all items that people consume are impacted. And I guess a concern for us from a TransUnion perspective is that when we start to pay more for everyday consumer goods and services, it impacts on our disposable income.
Yeah.
And that's the worry for me as a consumer and for you as a consumer. Are we able to keep our payments on time? Now, when you think about TransUnion, you talk about the consequences for lenders. What are consumers having to worry about? Because I'm assuming that when you think about repayments, there's a consequence if they can't actually make the repayments. What should consumers be thinking about right now as we prepare for this change in VAT?
Yeah, so it's definitely to keep a track on their budgets, to watch their affordability, to understand what the impact on their households is with regards to their spends. But I think communication is also quite important from a consumer perspective. They need to engage with their lenders. They need to understand what are their options, what are the sort of restructuring of the loans that they have, the ability to make sure that they can service that. I mean, also keeping an eye on their credit scores, being aware of this various impacts and making sure that they don't get adversely affected in the longer term, as they're starting to build their credit profiles for future inclusion.
That's really interesting. I've been at this role for some 8 years, and in the time I've been at TransUnion Africa, I've noticed that very few consumers access their credit reports.
Yeah.
Probably it's an important point just to call out that knowledge is power.
100%. Credit
reports are available from any one of the credit bureaus in South Africa and from other banks and lenders. Having the knowledge helps you understand your current indebtedness and should give you the knowledge you need to make better choices.
Yeah.
The second thing you spoke about, and it's important to go back to, and I want to get your view as to what it practically means.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that the income tax tables weren't adjusted.
Yeah.
Practically, what does it mean for consumers? We just heard that the take-home pays have in fact gone up, as reported by Banksub, and that talks to the interest rate declines, improvement in inflation, improvement in the economy. What does this now mean for people that don't just have to take the impact of VAT, that now have to potentially pay more taxes?
Yeah, well, if you think about it, like the budget is adjusted for 18 billion. So the revenue services are anticipated to get 18 billion, right? So if you're thinking that because the tax brackets didn't change, you're okay, the money has to come from somewhere, right? So it's those people that presumably got an adjustment for inflation, got moved into a higher tax bracket, and now essentially they're paying more tax over what they might have previously paid before the increase. So it kind of counteracts other efforts to fight inflation from a consumer perspective. So again, we're seeing that their actual disposable income might be even less. So even those increases that we boast about and happy about is not real. So they don't see it real in the customers' pockets.
Okay, I understand. The employment base in South Africa will have some form of impact.
Yeah.
If you're a tax-paying employee, you will be impacted. And if you're a non-tax-paying employee, as a normal consumer, you could find an increase in the cost of everyday goods.
Yep.
In the end, for us, that means a potential impact on inflation in South Africa.
Correct.
The last reported inflation came in at some 3.2%.
Yeah.
We could see that start to increase. It's probably worth watching from a business perspective.
Yeah.
Let's just swap topics if we can slightly. One of the things I watched for in the actual budget speech was what are the things we're doing for small, medium and micro enterprises.
Yeah.
As you're well aware, it's a narrative we've been talking about for many years. And I guess why is it an important topic for TransUnion? Well, it's quite simple. Some 70% of all employment on the continent comes from small, medium and micro enterprises.
Yeah.
Now, Ayesha, were there any things in the budget speech that you took away around SMMEs? Is there specific support that you saw that gives us an indication that SMMEs will have a better time in the way forward?
Mm-hmm. Look, I think there's a lot that we need to see, unfold because essentially there wasn't anything directly pointed for relief for SME. But if you think about the investment in infrastructure and the investment in water and lights, those does affect the supply chain. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword because now the SMEs, they find themselves with some reprieve, but in the same line, the supply chain is affected by the increase in VAT. So it's a matter of how they counteract those increased prices with the investment in infrastructure. And again, I guess it's a timing thing, right? So how quickly will we see the impact of the change in infrastructure, whereas almost immediately they start seeing an increase in their supply chain. So there's definitely an impact in them. Again, we're seeing that their disposable income will most likely also, start to come under strain, especially as we start initiating these changes from the 1st of May. And then there's a knock-on effect, right? So as they start increasing their own costs, their bottom line goes down. Again, that 70% gets impacted because the ability to hire more people and to grow sustainably also comes under strain. So I just think that SMEs will also have to be cautious, really understand what are these changes doing to their business and their supply chains. Also, like with the increase in VAT, right? Some SMEs find themselves in very competitive markets. So, raising the price, even though VAT, could put strain on their business and their competitiveness. So they might get to the point and decide, we most likely want to absorb some of those costs instead of passing onto their clients, further strain on their profitability. So there's many knock-on effects that come to play as we try to, figure out what will really, be the benefits or some of the concerns that SMEs will see out of the budget.
Well, I understand that. I think there's a few things, but it's probably worth picking out from that. One, the budget speech does talk to investment in structural components of the economy. As South Africans, we've seen that the investment in fixing electricity has bode well for our economy.
Yeah.
We've seen a revision in GDP, some calling in the 1.5% mark. It's a far cry away from the GDP of the broader sub-Saharan Africa, but we're definitely heading in the right direction. As you think about water, transport, logistics, if in fact the money ends up in these key areas, we should see the elements of the economy that drive job creation come into play. And that's important not just for SMMEs, but for the high number of unemployed.
Yeah.
As we know, the unemployed people are probably some 31.9%, and that's just the reported basis.
Yeah.
It's probably a lot more, and it's a large proportion from the 18 to 24 part of the population, which we refer to as the youth.
Yeah.
Going back to the point on SMME, my own reflection on what you've said is that SMEs are going to be impacted. I worry less about the medium-sized enterprises who are able to access finances and have more robust finances, and they're more appealing to the banking sector. For the micro enterprises themselves, these very small entrepreneurs that we rely on to spur new jobs in our rural economies, these are the ones that will struggle. They typically have the same pressures because they are funding their businesses using their household incomes. And I think the cost that they're now going to take on, it may impact the ability to drive cash flow to make their businesses survive, and they may be less appealing for financing from established banking sector. So that's an important part. The one thing that I did note, which I think is a positive thing, is a discussion about education. And that's something I've been really passionate about. I always talk about the growth of the population in Africa, not just South Africa, but the youth in this continent. We average an age of some 19 years of age, and that means that we're a young African population. What do you think about the future of digital skills and education? Are we doing enough? Did you hear the elements that you would want to hear that talks about how we are mobilizing the workforce for the potential of AI and technology that lies ahead?
I didn't hear enough, to be honest. I think it was very, very sort of high level, just generic education, but I don't think they went into detail of upskilling the youth and our general population, right? I mean, we do know that we have to evolve and our kids have to evolve, and we look at the investment in education in the last couple of years, it's very skewed to certain sectors and very skewed to certain sort of areas and schools, but it's also still at the very basic level. There are many students, kids in our population that are still struggling for basic education, and so we want to talk about what are the next steps. And we need to be talking about AI, we need to be talking about digital enhancement, but there's still so many that don't even have the basics yet. So I feel like the government still needs to prioritize that and still needs to move some of the funding to more of focusing on basic needs in education, and unfortunately that's where our future development and our sort of incremental development is actually going to suffer.
That's fair. I think the budget's a tough budget, not just for government, but for everyday consumers and businesses. Hopefully there's more to come in future. The reality though is that Africa will be the world's workforce, right? We need to invest in the skills now that are needed to allow us to participate in the global economy. Having said that though, it is tough throughout the world from a geopolitical perspective, from an economic environment perspective. And right now, it'll be good to see how this budget evolves from what was presented yesterday into an enactment as law over the next few days and weeks. Maybe we can wrap up this conversation by bringing it back to who we are as TransUnion. In the end, we're a large part a credit bureau that supports businesses and consumers. Let me ask you, from a consumer perspective, if you can just remind our viewers today, what advice would we give to consumers that are feeling the crunch of this potential VAT increase? What does it mean for their household, but also maybe rather talk about what they should do about it? What is your best advice as a TransUnion Head of Research and Consulting?
Well, go back to the point, knowledge is power. Equip yourself with the knowledge that you need to understand what you need in terms of your household to sustain all of these changes. Be aware of sort of your debt portfolio, be aware of what your debts are in terms of your installments and your rate conversations. And also don't be afraid to have those conversations with your lenders. I mean, obviously the last thing lenders want is for you to default on your loan. So they do offer assistance, in terms of debt consolidation and sort of respreading if necessary, but also keep track of your credit record and, make sure that you're also aware of, as you make changes and as you're sort of having these conversations with your lenders, you understand the impact that it has on your personal finances as well as your household finances.
That makes perfect sense. I think the reality though is that knowledge is power and is more freely available than people think. So for me, if you're a consumer watching today, you want to pick up the phone, you want to go to the websites, and not just of TransUnion, there are 6 credit bureaus in South Africa, and many banks and lenders also give you access to credit reports. So it's worth reaching out, because when you understand what you need to know, you can make better choices. From my perspective, Ayesha, it's worth just reflecting on our conversation on SMMEs. It's worth reminding our small businesses and the lenders that lend money to small businesses that small businesses are key to the growth of the economy. We need to find a way for SMEs, like consumers, to understand their level of financial health, to understand what they're doing, the choices they're making. In a tough economic environment, everybody needs to make better choices. We need to consider widely where we spend our money. We need to deleverage from finance if needed, and make choices that are relevant in the short term based on our household income, and defer things that aren't needed for today. My ask also of the lending environment is, we've had a lot of innovation that we've been lucky to be part of as TransUnion over the last 5 or so years. There's innovation in seeing the potential in small businesses. My hope is that lenders and banks are able to look at this as an opportunity to revise their decisioning strategies, their credit strategies, on how they can partner better with this key segment of our economy. If we get SMEs right and they're able to come into their own, we know as a matter of fact that SMEs typically create 1 to 5 jobs. The more SMEs that come into play, I do hope and believe it'll lead to the growth of our economy and spur on employment for all our people. This is what we really need. So Ayesha, that brings to an end our conversation. It was a tough budget speech. I hope these are the key points that our viewers, our audience need to take away, to reflect on what will be a tough period ahead. But in the end, as we've said a few times now, knowledge is power. We can take control of our own destiny if we understand what we're dealing with. Thank you, Ayesha.
Thanks, Lee.